Joining a professional body has never been more important. Join thousands of other professionals just like you who are getting ahead with CIHT membership. Go to the CIHT website and discover exclusive resources and why the leaders and future leaders of the sector are members with CIHT. Welcome to CIHT Podcasts.
Welcome to Transport Talks, CIHT's podcast. Today we are talking about inclusive travel in professional practice as part of National Inclusion Week. I'm your host, Isabel Wilson. Today I am joined by a panel of three people whose work, each in a unique way, involves making transport more inclusive. I have with me Michael Barratt, who is a Construction Advisory and Innovations Manager for Transport for London. Michael is a Chartered Engineer and Fellow of the CIHT. He has over 30 years' experience within the construction, haulage and security industries and currently leads a team that helps constructors implement safe and accessible and efficient logistical interventions. I also have with me Simone West, who is the Inclusive Design Advisor within the Diversity and Inclusion team at Transport for London. Simone is primarily concerned with how we ensure inclusion is considered to enhance customer experience and ensure that our network is welcoming and suitable for everyone. And last but certainly not least, we have Esther Layton, who is a member of IDAG, and Esther has been working with them since 2005 in training and consultancy around diversity and inclusion. Why don't each of you introduce yourselves just so the listeners can get a sense of whose voice belongs to who, and then we can get started.
I'm Esther Layton. I'm a member of IDAG, which is the Independent Disability Advisory Group, and we work with TfL but external to TfL on various D&I projects, but with a particular focus on disability.
Hi, I'm Simone. I'm Inclusive Design Advisor at TfL. So my particular focus, as the name suggests, is on built environment and inclusive design. Obviously work very closely with IDAG, who have been absolutely brilliant allies and are a great resource for us to tap into. We work with Michael, although he probably doesn't need us so much. He just goes off and absolutely storms what he does. So doing some absolutely amazing work. And we're covering quite a lot. I've given a shout out to everybody else. I haven't really said what I do, have I? It's quite broad, is the problem, in that it's anything to do with diversity and inclusion. But yes, my particular focus within the team, as I said, is on the built environment, which in itself is quite large.
Yeah, and Michael, I'm the Construction Advisory and Innovations Manager, which was a long title. But before it was Development Impact Assessment Manager, and no one knew what that meant. So as I advise on construction and do innovation, it kind of made sense to have that title. Simone, humble as usual. So I need Simone and team to guide me, which I have been doing for quite a while. I've done somewhat of IDAG as well over the past. But my main role is around temporary environments. Even though I'm an Equality Impact Assessment super user, which is another mouthful, making sure we do, under the duty of the Equality Act, we do what we say we're supposed to be doing. But with the temporary environment, it's different, and there's a lot of challenges, and there's a lot of, to be diplomatic, more focus on the monetary side of stuff and getting construction done quicker, and the impact on communities. And because I've been over the years been doing a lot with community, I get the ear bashing from the community about what they're not doing or what they're doing that's negative. So over the years, I've been trying to look at how do we improve that relationship.
IDAG are very enthusiastic about that work because we see that the impact on disabled people of temporary construction projects can often be disproportionate and not usually deliberately, but it needs people like Michael who are kind of trying to keep an eye on that and try to encourage projects that are just one-off and temporary to still be thinking about all of those inclusion things.
When we talk about these temporary projects, in my mind, I'm picturing roadworks that take up the pavement, and so wheelchair users can't get around them. But I'm guessing that's quite maybe my simplistic view of it. Is there more complex things to it than that as well?
Yeah, well, the visual disability is a wheelchair, but people forget about invisible disability. So we look at colour. So there's some colours, complex patterns, how much, there's too much text, different size fonts. So you're thinking dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, learning disability, autism, ADHD, different ways of being impacted. And they big developments, not just roadworks, like to shut footways and send people on a 400-metre walk. And I've worked with people with rheumatoid arthritis, who literally, one woman who came out with me, it felt like she's got one foot in front of the other, the speed she was walking, and we had to stop every few metres because she was in pain. Now, you send that person on a 400-metre walk, they're not going to want to do it.
They can also have quite a big impact on people who are visually impaired. So they might know a particular route and either not be able to or find it very difficult to read signage. So they might not, the environment's changed and they don't know what's happened. And then if temporary crossings aren't laid out in the same way, then it might be very confusing. It can confuse some people's guide dogs. And then, as Michael was saying, there's lots of people who are neurodivergent in any of a whole number of ways, so it can have a really big impact on. So I'm particularly thinking of people with dementia who might find it just very confusing and not be able to do something that previously they were able to do reliably. So which then, it can knock people's confidence if they go out to do something that they feel confident doing and something goes wrong, then that can have a big impact on other areas of people's lives, not necessarily just that one route where there was some kind of temporary work happening.
I think often when we talk about making transport inclusive, maybe the first thing that comes to people's minds is, wheelchair users, there's got to be lifts. But that's such a minor point of what inclusive travel is. It's one very secular bit, and inclusive travel needs to cover a whole range. So I wanted to ask you what inclusive travel meant for you.
I've definitely got thoughts about how inclusive travel is much, much broader than that. But I also wanted to pull apart this wheelchair user thing as well, because I think sometimes we think about wheelchair users as a generic group of people, but actually wheelchair users are a really, really varied group. And often wheelchair access will work for some wheelchair users, but not others, or might work in some situations, but not others. Even something that's thought of as wheelchair accessible might not work for all wheelchair users. And wheelchair users are a really varied group as well. So most wheelchair users don't use a wheelchair all the time. So they might be wheelchair users some of the time and use another mobility aid or walk but have a mobility impairment some of the time. They might use a mixture of mobility aids at different times. And all of those things require different things in the built environment and from policy. So I absolutely agree that it's much, much, much wider than just wheelchair users, but also even wheelchair users are quite a complicated group with lots of different needs that need thinking about.
I think that's a really good point. Picking up from there, just the example of the extent of wheelchair users is great, but you could also apply that then to visual impairment. I mean, neurodiversity on itself is absolutely incredibly diverse. And of course, what you've also got to consider is intersectionality, i.e., whilst it's easy for perhaps designers and constructors and, when we're thinking about this, to put people in neat boxes and understand what impacts them, we also have to understand that people fit into other boxes. So if you've got like the protected characteristics underneath the Equality Act, which is often what we use, people will fit into 4, 5, 6, they could fit into a lot of those, and there are a lot of impacts on each of those. And so it isn't just one sort of, as Esther said, homogenous group neatly packaged, whether that's under, women, parents, neurodiverse, whether we look at race or religion or any of the other protected characteristics, they usually sit in more than one. And actually a really useful document for people, well, in London, of course, is Understanding Our Diverse Communities, which was a TfL document, but it's available on the internet. It was done in 2019. And it specifically looks at all of these sort of intersectionalities and the complexities and looks at sort of how different groups move around, what the pressures are on them, what the feelings are across those. And it's complicated, but it helps to give a better picture of who is using what and why, and then the restrictions on them, because some groups will have less options and less opportunity, and particularly where we make changes in the environment, perhaps on a temporary basis, they can't adapt to that as easily, whether that's because of financial or because of access or availability or all kinds of measures. So yeah, it's enormous. And I mean, it is everyone, but I understand it's very difficult for people to visualize what everyone means.
It changes over time as well. So disability particularly, but some of the other characteristics as well. As we get older, our bodies change. You might break your leg at some point and then your leg heals. You might be recovering from an operation. You might have a load of shopping and therefore be a bit less able to move around than you are at another time, or you've got a fluctuating condition that varies. So people's way that they interact with transport and the things that they need aren't the same even on a given day, let alone over a lifetime. And we need to be thinking when we're designing about all of the people who we want to feel kind of welcome and able to use that space. As far as possible, we don't want people to feel that they're not able to use spaces at some particular point in their life or for some of the time.
Picking up on your point there, Esther, about thinking about travel for those we want to use it, for maybe the benefit of our listeners who might be coming from this from a different point of view. If you wanted to paint a picture of transport users for them, what picture would you paint?
Gosh, well, I mean, hopefully transport users is everyone, isn't it? You know, I would like transport users to be everyone. I think I really believe that transport users should be everyone, but that's not quite how it pans out at the moment, because often transport welcomes some people more than others. So there are some groups of people, so some types of disabled people, all sorts of groups of people who feel less safe on transport, less able to use it, where it takes more energy, where they can't use some bits of transport and can use others, who don't use transport as much. So I don't think that transport users do quite reflect the whole community, and that there's lots of write-up about that in Understanding Our Diverse Communities that Simone mentioned before. But I think that's what we're aiming for, is that it should be for everyone. You know, it should be cradle to grave at all points that you can get around.
I was going to say it's about choice of transport as well. So we always think public transport is mechanical. I know cycling is mechanical, but it's not engine motivated, let's say. But there's a lot of access that is missed with cycling and walking because of conditions and surfaces and behaviours, other behaviours around that. So there's a lot of work to do. But yeah, if you're looking at being all inclusive in transport and accessible, it's having that choice of as much as possible, as diverse modes that you can get access to.
That follows on nicely actually to what my next question was going to be, which is, what does inclusive transport mean within professional practice, and how can we as professional bodies ensure we're going about the right way to make transport more inclusive?
I think it's a combination of different things. I think an important factor is ensuring that people look at it from the beginning. You know, inclusion is something that needs to be thought about right from the beginning and right through to the end. So in a sense, it's partly about process, because you need to be looking at it at the right time. So for example, at the beginning of a project, if it's a decent sized project, you might want to have an inclusive design strategy for that project. And by that, I mean that you've got a clear vision about what your objectives are and what you're trying to achieve, and what the standards are that are relevant. And that way you get everybody understanding what the vision is for inclusion, and you get a consistency in how people are measuring it, because that needs to set out how are we going to ensure. So how are we going to engage? How are we going to appraise and review designs? how are we going to do that through the whole process? And another important part, it isn't also, we tend sometimes to think it's a one-off exercise that happens some point during the design process and then we're done with inclusion and we're all good. But of course, what happens is designs change, criteria changes, and if no one is there who understands what inclusive design means, then really important things can get lost. Important features can get lost in procurement. Something can come up cheaper, and if there's the option to go for that with no understanding of implication, then it can get dropped, and there's nobody there to pick it back up again if we haven't got those processes and checks in place. And then even on construction sites, I mean, we do have, I know you can't see pictures, but we have got collections of amazing pictures where definitely people have made decisions on sites, perhaps cycle lanes maybe going through bus stop areas and things like that, which we really wouldn't want. And I suspect, wouldn't be designed that way. But for whatever reason, and sometimes perfectly valid reasons, result in things we wouldn't want on site. And again, you need to have those checks there. Otherwise, where you started from is not where you end up. So it's a whole process, and people need to know when to call in an expert. I think there's also a very big idea that everybody is suddenly, if they can all just think about inclusion, then it's all going to come good. And whilst I absolutely want to raise the profile of inclusion for everybody, that's a given, there are people who are experts in this field. And I think we have to understand and know when we need to invite those people to the table.
Yeah, definitely. We just had our CIHT Awards last night, and the winner of the EDI award was Manchester City Council for their Highways Access Group. And one thing I really liked about this project of theirs was that they paid their experts to come in, and it wasn't, sometimes it's voluntary and you ask people to provide their viewpoint, but I think it really shows the value of it when you can. And obviously not everyone can always pay people.
I also want to differentiate between engagement and professionalism. I'm actually talking about professional people who are part of a design team who have expertise in inclusive design. And I'm not, it's not that it should be that and it shouldn't be engagement, it should be both of them. But I just want to be very clear that engagement is not the same thing as having professional people involved in that design process.
Can I just add, I kind of disagree with the word expert. I don't believe there is any. And I think when you put somebody on a pedestal as expert, they're less likely to probably want to engage with others to get their point of view. So I normally use the word somebody who specialises, because you're never up to date. You can be way behind on stuff. But I think also for the professional side is we need to be aware of the holistic impacts. So if you're going to be doing all inclusive, say for example, you design something that is nice for cycling and walking, causes congested areas with pollution, because you will generate pollution if you congest areas, but then that then will impact on people with any breathing disorder. Asthma can get impacted. So we're actually causing a disability again from the actions what we're doing. So it's bringing that holistic thinking. So then you are looking at all inclusive. And then also how you segregate communities, which we can do as well by what we design, which impacts on economies. And that can then impact especially on, poverty.
Esther, did you want to?
I was thinking your question about professional practice. I just had a thought about that. So for me, professionals almost always know what's going on in their field in terms of standards and regulations and all of those things that they need to follow. And then they've also got internal things in the business or organisation that they're part of that they've also got to follow. And they're aware of all of those kind of sometimes competing things that they must do. I think one of the things that kind of specialisation or expertise in this area can sometimes bring is knowledge about how those are changing, because often the regulations and standards in inclusive design particularly change over time, and they're often quite far behind basically they take a very long time to happen and then a long time to change. So if I can think about an example that's happening at the moment, there's been a growing awareness that the reference size, which is the specific size of wheelchair that transport is supposed to accommodate, that the reference size is somewhat out of date in some ways and doesn't work for a growing number of people. And then quite recently, the Department for Transport put out a big report about big piece of research about the reference wheelchair size, which found that about half of wheelchair users are not accommodated by the current reference size. And so it looks very likely that the reference size will be changing, and you can make some reasonable guesses as to how that might be based on knowledge of how wheelchairs are changing and the content of that research. But that might not be something that people who aren't in that area can know about. But if they design to the current specification, then they might be really gutted in just a small amount of time when they discover that their design doesn't quite work for this large group of people, or kind of seems out of date really quickly. So I think inclusion professionals can help people to make their design more future proof and to make their design current and up to date in a way that standards can't always achieve.
Can I just add to what Esther said, because I absolutely agree, but I almost want to emphasize it because it's fairly common in sort of engineering and design circles that there's a heavy reliance on standards. And it's not to say that standards don't have a place. They do. They absolutely do. They set a really good baseline. They help inform. They're really, really useful. But going back, and this is the point Esther made, is that in a sense, you've always got to view standards as slightly behind the curve, because the way the process works, we know that the reference size is too small, but we've known that for some time. It's been out of date. You know, we finally get some research through. How long before that filters into actually changing standards and changing that reference size? And I can't quite put a figure in terms of years, but this isn't the only incident. There's lots of other areas. It happened with changing places, where there were projects where we were preempting that we should be using changing places, even though it wasn't in there yet, but we knew it. And I think this is the important bit. When people are using standards, they're often not like other standards that are in the engineering environment that sets a baseline. You've often got to aim higher than the standard to make sure that you're future proofing and you're dealing with the change that society is going to need to move forwards. And I think that is really important.
There's lots of really complex interrelations as well. So at the moment, we really want people to engage in a modal shift towards cycling. Well, if cycling infrastructure doesn't keep up with what disabled people need in cycling, which is often different, then we'll end up with a modal shift which is not equal. And those kind of things take longer to filter through to standards and so on. So it's really important that people are aware of what's changing and all of those interrelations. And it's probably impossible for them, for people to know about everything, which is where working with people whose area is like what's happening in inclusion is sometimes helpful.
And on that point of engagement, how do you think we can create and sustain meaningful engagement to make sure that we engage people who use the transport system, but also maybe more importantly, those who don't use it, and why aren't they using it?
I think you make a really good point there about who's not using it, and it's a very hard group to tap into. And I think the important thing to raise there as well is that people often engage and they forget that a lot of people are excluded. And I don't have all the answers. I mean, I don't sit in the engagement team. So in terms of engaging with those sort of seldom heard voices, and perhaps the people that are just so disengaged because it does not apply to them, because they can't use transport, and yet they would have a really valuable voice. And there is an onus on organisations like TfL to engage with those very people, because that is how we learn, and it is really important. And I mean, TfL, a lot smaller organisations are not going to find all of these so easy, but we do have different types and levels So we have a sort of broad one, which are our customer insights, where we go out to, say, 100 disabled and older people, and we constantly get a pulse of what's happening and what the feeling is, and across other groups as well. So you've got that. You go to the other extreme, probably, where you've got IDAG, which are a bit like the example you mentioned earlier about, groups that are engaged. Well, IDAG is particularly important to us because IDAG brings professional expertise with lived experience. And that is absolutely invaluable to us. And that's on a much closer level. And actually, Esther, I'm taking away, because you could provide much more information on IDAG, perhaps.
Sure. So, yeah, I was thinking of two types of kind of finding out more information when you were asking this question. So IDAG brings a professional experience, often in specific professional areas, but also lived experience and a kind of understanding of what's happening with particular groups of people. And we are engaged as external consultants to TfL, and they ask us to work on particular projects where they need that. And then I think of kind of engagement much broader than that, like Simone was talking about, where I would like to see teams going out to people who they might not otherwise catch, who are not going to find something on a website or reply to something that's written somewhere. And IDAG isn't that, but we will sometimes help the engagement team in TfL. So if they've got a particular project where they want to find out information from a particular group of people, they'll come to us and say, we really want information from this group of people who we know are underrepresented, and we're not sure how to get in touch with them, and we know that they're not going to reply to something on our website. And IDAG will assist the engagement team in working out where to find those people, what kind of support they might need in order to actually reply. And the fact that will often really vary. So some people might need somebody to phone them up and talk them through the questions and explain the questions to them. Other people might need some kind of focus group. People are disparate. You won't find them all together in one place. And if you put on an event, they're not all going to come. So you need to go out and find them. And what IDAG will do is help the team work out who they're trying to find, and then work out how they might do that and how they can maximize the responses they can get. So what kind of questions can they ask, which will be easy to understand and will garner the information that they really need in order to make decisions about the project? What kind of adjustments do they need? Do they need things in different formats? Are there any particular people who are going to need any specialist help? What kind of thing will that be? Those kind of things. So I help them come up with a plan that the engagement team can then go away and implement that plan to engage with a much wider group.
Yeah, Isabel, so it's great. I think TfL are really lucky having IDAG, but there's a lot of projects out there that are not TfL, like utility companies, developers that can't get that access. So we're working on something called the 3-tier assessment. This is kind of deemed now TfL best practice of our contractors, where tier 1 is you get to know that local community as best as you can. So not every community is going to be the same across London. And the idea is that they do some investigation into their planned works. So what kind of centres are in the area? Is there a centre for children with autism? Is there a mobility impairment centre? Older people's homes? All that stuff that you need to consider. The likelihood that they're going to be negotiating your traffic management to get to where they want to. And you learn from that community. If you can't dig in deep, councillors are really good because they tend to know their communities really well. But there's also local groups like Living Streets. Plus, you've got the London Cycle Campaign and their members who will be aware of potentially disabled cyclists in the area. Once you've got that, knowing who you need to think about, then you can include that in your design. And that's then tier 2. When the traffic management then goes out, you've hopefully considered tier 1 and tier 2 in your design. And then tier 3 is you go and test it, or you'll be getting feedback from that local community you've worked with in the first place, which means you're including the community in your design. It doesn't happen everywhere. It's something we've been working on. CIHT have recognised it a few years ago, but it's been pushed. And I think this is where, because a few members of IDA have been out in the past to help promote that. But again, it's a limited resource, IDAG, because you wouldn't be able to do 5,000 developments, 10,000 sets of roadworks that are major stuff around the city. But it's putting the onus on the contractors now to start engaging a bit more.
Yeah, that's a really good point actually about the contractors, because I feel that's maybe not just unique to inclusive transport. It feels like onus on contractors kind of can span quite a few different projects from my experience.
It's the level of interest. So you'll have high level management that are very interested in this because it's meeting their tick boxes, but the people who are on the ground doing the work aren't aware. So it's how do you educate the people that are on the ground, the frontline staff, that potentially could have keep an eye out to see if anybody's struggling around their site or might need some help. You shouldn't assume everybody needs help. So we have been giving training for frontline staff on that.
And have you seen positive results from that? How long's that been going on for?
We've had some good stuff. I'll give an example of Thames Water in Hammersmith, who were working outside a block of flats that had a centre for people with vision impairment. And they asked us to go and have a look at the layout they'd done. They'd put all the temporary signals on top of the tactile or behind the existing post. So if somebody went to the push button that was switched off, they didn't realise that there's one behind it that was actually working, and to relocate stuff. But then also talk to staff how to approach people. So if somebody was using a long cane in front of you, you could introduce yourself. So the layout that you're coming towards has changed. If you've got this, off you go. If you need a bit of help, let me know and I'll steer you through it. So there's no, you're not kind of patronising anybody. But there's training, but there's great training for management, but there's not enough training for the staff, actually the workers. And plus they've got a job, they've got to think about their safety and their colleagues' safety while they're doing some of the jobs. So they're not always going to be able to look around what's going on, but I think it's important that we share that learning.
That's interesting, actually, what you say about it being there for the managers, but not the workers, because I think sometimes when we talk about EDI in general, you have like the trickle down, and it's kind of said, if those in the high up levels are aware, then it should form a culture that spans the whole company. But I guess maybe is that not what you've experienced? The needs are just different from the managers to the workers who are on site.
Well, everyone's got different focuses. So some people want to go do the work, go home. They don't want to get involved in too much nitty-gritty. They don't want to do any further education. We have to respect that, but there's certain things you can expect or kind of at least train into people, a bit more vigilance, because it's about their safety as well. Because you don't want somebody walking into your site. That's happened. People have fallen into sites, walked into sites. They can get seriously hurt, which then they're liable because they're not maintaining their site. So they do need to be aware of this.
I also think, not necessarily on construction sites, but there is a distinct difference between having really good policy and strategy, which is really important. And part of what you're saying, on the trickle down, that's great, but that won't necessarily explain. And what we have to do is fill the gap between the actual, what does that mean? What does that mean in terms of how I'm delivering on a gate line or on a bus, or even how I'm delivering as an architect or an engineer? We can have policies and process, things in place that say, do all of this inclusively, but what does that actually mean for the individual? And I think that's sometimes the gap that's missing, is that there isn't a translation always from sort of policy and good intentions to what that actually means for you doing your job. And I think we need to work harder at making sure everybody knows what it means for them within the parameters of their job. And again, where they can go for additional help. Where is the expertise? Because we can't just put this on people and go, you sort it out. We have to give support, learning, and we have to have people who can assist them with that in making that process real.
I just wanted to echo that inclusion is something that everyone's job involves it somewhere, but sometimes people aren't always clear where their job involves it, and it might not be the focus of their job. The example that springs to mind is Simone and I spend quite a lot of time, not very glamorous, but in toilets. And One of the things that I see both in my professional work with Transport for London and with other clients, and also in my day-to-day life as a wheelchair user, is that often a toilet will be designed pretty well, and then when the bins are emptied, that they're put back next to the toilet, which is a space that makes the most sense for somebody who gets around walking on two legs most of the time, but actually is right in the way of where you need to put your wheelchair to transfer. That is something that when cleaning staff understand what the transfer space is, then they will always put the bins back somewhere else. But if you're not a wheelchair user, you don't have a wheelchair user in your family, nobody's ever told you that in your training, then how would you ever know that? And it's those kind of things which all add up if they're in lots of places across a period of time. And so I think it's really important that those things that are important in everyone's job are passed on to everyone, and that people don't just think that their role is, I don't know, emptying the bins, for example, but they understand the inclusion part of emptying the bins.
No, that's such a good example. And I will admit I would never have thought of that myself either.
And on standards, like Simone knows that I have an absolute bugbear for something which is not covered in standards at all, which is, why do pedal bins exist in wheelchair accessible toilets that are designed for independent wheelchair users to use? Many of us cannot operate a pedal bin. And again, it's one of those things that when you think it through, you're like, yeah, that's not the right thing to procure. And it's relatively easy to roll out.
No, definitely. And it's like when you start thinking about a small example like bins in toilets, but you can extrapolate it to so many other things that is just no one thought of it clearly. And you need to have that engagement that we spoke about earlier to make sure that you are considering everyone.
I've got a lovely example of a brand new development. It's not finished yet. So we were inside and asked where the toilet was, and they said it was down on the left. So we went down, there was nothing protruding through the wall to say where the toilet was. It was a black door with dark green letters saying DDAWC. And I said, why are you still doing that? Number one, there's no contrast what you're doing. Number two, there's no sign that you can see on the corridor. And there was a young woman who had a vision impairment who used a long cane and scanned. So she would have to come up very close to something to even know what it was. And she didn't know what DDA was, because she was only 16. I didn't know what DDAWC meant. What's the WC bit? And you think we should be up to date, we should know better. When I questioned, they were like, didn't know what to say. And they still haven't changed it, because I went back in a month later.
One of the things about engagement that I also think is interesting, and I'm thinking here not of IDAG, but of the kind of engagement that we're talking about, where you're trying to get information from members of the public, and you're wanting information from members of the public about things that have gone wrong in their life from people who probably have many things every time they leave the house that go wrong in their life. And so you're asking for something quite valuable, which is their time. The most important thing is that we listen to that and action that. And if people reliably knew that when they said, oh, hang on, the bin's been put in the right place, that would mean that there was an impact on the training for the cleaners, and that somebody was going to check that the bins were in the right place, and therefore that by feeding that back, that in the future the bin would be in the right place, then people are much more inclined to do that. So there's a relationship between who engages and who doesn't as to whether or not they feel heard and that their input is valued. So we need to treat people's input as precious as it is and listen to it. And we can't always do everything that everyone wants, obviously, but we need to really take that on, and getting the information is not the process. It's what we do with that information that is the focus.
We've spoken about what inclusive transport means and how to get a sustainable engagement. And I was wondering if maybe we could end on everyone giving their top 3 benefits that we can achieve from having an inclusive transport system?
The benefits are enormous. The social impact, I'll pick the social impact because, these all have knock-on effects. If people can't get out and about independently, then actually that has a much bigger effect. It has an effect on a lot of people as individuals. So in terms of their social life, in terms of their work life, in terms of education, all kinds of things that many people may take for granted. If we can't get the transport network working well for people, then they're going to miss out on opportunities that other people have. Now that can, and this may sound drastic, but there's evidence that it does lead to potentially isolation, social isolation. Now that can lead to depression, it can lead to lower incomes, poverty, it can lead to mental health issues, it can lead to so many things that actually have a slightly destructive and non-helpful impact on all of us, and not only a financial impact on society as a whole, but I think it's kind of a lifeblood that allows people to live their lives in a full way. And what we cannot do is simply say, get a car, because not everybody can have a car, not everybody can independently use a car, and we don't want people to use cars. We want them to use our transport network and move away from cars. And so we have to provide that. And I think the social impacts for me are, and so I'm only going to choose one because I think that would be unfair to nab top three from everybody else.
I think that one of the biggest benefits is that the project will stay relevant for longer. It will be useful to people for a much longer period of time, and people will be excited about it. And people's feelings about it will be positive. People who feel excluded, that's a really difficult set of feelings. Like, as Simone was saying, feel really sad, and it's linked to an inability to see your friends, to work, to do things that bring us joy in life. And the other way, being able to get around makes people feel vibrant and engaged with life and happy.
For me, for the people, I like to see people smiling. I think if you see people who aren't smiling and they're smiling, it blows up the room. And being valued, and I think that's what we need to aim at. There's equality, equity, valued, so many different words in there, but also I know a lot of people who want to help, want to help with the environment. They're put in a situation where they can't, and they'd like to be sustainable more, but the environment doesn't allow that, which again comes down to value. I'm just going to stick with value, being valued.
I'm gonna add just a few more little ones, if that's all right. Well, they might not be so little, but I was thinking for many organisations, reputation, and I think there is a reputational issue that is, closely guarded by many organisations. Getting this right or getting it wrong can be significant for reputation, and that in itself can encourage or discourage customers. And this is another thing: you open up your customer base. If you open it up to older people and disabled people, and in fact all the protected characteristics, you open up a massive customer base. And it's not just about that individual, but it's about their friends, it's about who's travelling with them, it's about all those knock-on choices. And also there's meeting legal obligations. As service delivery, as transport providers, we have legal obligations. So even if nothing else, there is that legal issue. And reducing costs of rectifying. Now, this happens all the time. There are some things we cannot rectify. Ergo, to Esther's point, we perhaps lose an opportunity of future-proofing and making something more desirable. But there are things we can rectify, and then that costs us, whereas it may not have cost us before if we thought about it earlier. So there are cost implications. People talk about the cost of making something inclusive and how much more does that add. But actually, I think there are often occasions where it's cost you more not to. And if you pull all of these things together, the cost of not doing it far outweighs the cost of doing it. So if people just want to talk about finance, I think there is an argument that's evidenced.
I always think of finance as having kind of three levels as well. Like, you increase your revenue because there's a group of people who are, there who wouldn't have been otherwise. but it's almost always cheaper to do inclusion well at the beginning and in the planning stages. And as you go through the various stages of planning, to go back to it, because things change, and particularly big infrastructure projects can take a long time. And so it's important to keep reviewing those as they change. But then I think there's something a bit harder to pin down with a kind of figure on it, but that is also a really important cost to not doing things in the first place, which is that the feeling of something being kind of bolted on never results in what the designers were hoping and planning for. I remember when I was at university, I was involved in a piece of student media where I said that my predominant expertise was the location of large Grundon dustbins. And that's because as a wheelchair user, many of the ways that I got into buildings were through a route via the kind of commercial bins, maybe through a few people's offices. And you get a smaller set of that when things are bolted onto a space. Like, the feeling of going through a space is of being separate and of being other. And often some bits of the space work in a minimal sense, but people who are using access which is bolted on often aren't getting the kind of design of the building in the same way. And so I think it's important financially in getting money in, it's important in how much money is spent out, and it's important in ensuring that everyone is getting what is being meant by the new bit of work.
I think that links back to what Michael was saying as well about value, when you feel that you haven't just been an afterthought in the design process.
Yeah, just one word, isn't it? Sustainable. Sustainability is what we promote, and this is all inclusive, is that thinking, that design approach to be sustainable. And if we're not considering certain elements in design, we're not being sustainable. So it should be a bolt-on, like what Esther's talking about. It should be within. If you're looking at all-inclusive design, there shouldn't be a bolt-on.
Yeah, and also, I mean, real inclusive design, no one notices it, which sort of sounds slightly counterintuitive, but the actual reality is, if I have to make a decision because I'm being separated out from the crowd, I'm being made to go a different route, I'm being made to take a different journey, it's going to be longer, I'm doing something different that singles me out as different, as opposed to if I can literally do the same journey with no thoughts with my friends, my family, or other commuters, whatever the choice is, then that's real inclusion. And you'd hope someone would get to the end of that journey and go, what are you asking me? I just made a journey. And that would be the absolute ideal. The pinnacle of transport should be that no one realises that they've been thought about. They just have.
I think that's such a brilliant point to end on. And just before we stop the recording, is there any guidance or schemes that you would like to plug that you haven't had a chance to yet?
I did just want to say, we have talked about neurodiversity a little bit, and TfL is the main sponsor of a document that's coming out on the 27th of September, I hope. I mean, maybe the 30th, but the PAS is being delivered. And the reason I want to highlight it to people is because it's the first sort of national document that pulls a lot of really useful but disparate information together. And a PAS, it's a publicly available specification through the British Standards Institute. And what will happen, I see it as a first step. So if people can use it, there's going to be an opportunity of review. So people, if they download the document, will be able to feed back in how it was useful, how it wasn't, what else needs to go into it, what was missing, and hopefully also prompt people to carry out research and add and build that picture, because it is a complex area. And this is PAS 6463, which spells mind, if anybody's interested, on your telephone keypad. It's called Design for the Mind, and it's a guide. And I would absolutely encourage people, for that very broad internal, external environment piece, but I think there's more that can be done. It's not definitive, and I'd really like people to pick that up. And I think the transport industry needs more of that. I think there's more in other sectors like offices and residential, and transport needs to do more in that area. So I would encourage people to get that and get stuck in, and we will be listening when we come to review that document if people have things to say about it.
I think this is an amazing piece of work that Simone's had a massive part in. It's pulling together, like when we were talking about engagement, those lots of people saying, well, this is a problem in lots of ways, and a kind of growing understanding that there was this large group of people who weren't really accounted for. And it's not even necessarily people, it's a large group of needs that are not accounted for in standards as they have been. And I really love the way that it's really upfront that this won't be the final document. It's not the final say on how to include neurodiversity within the built environment, but it is an informed starting place, and it's something which is like a tool for people to use to make their design better, and for people to feed into to make the future design even better than that. And inclusion's like that. It's not you can't just do inclusion and be finished.
Isabel, we do run a lot of forums that people can attend, especially on the temporary environment. Helps with their brownie points for awards from Considered Constructors and BREEAM.
I'd really like to plug that the Centre for Accessible Environments is working with the City Bridge Trust to run a programme to support up and coming young disabled people who will often have greater barriers to work, but particular kind of skills and experience that are really important to develop professional experience in access consultancy, so that they can bring both their personal experience but also that specific knowledge to those kind of roles. I think that's really important because we really need more people working in this area.
Perfect. Well, I thank you all so much for your time. I learnt so much. I always find with these things, I'm like, yeah, I know a lot about EDI and inclusivity, and then you have a conversation, you're like, I hadn't thought of that bit. And so yeah, I think our listeners will really learn a lot from it. So thank you all so much for your time.
No, thank you.
Thanks, Isabel.
And thanks, Esther.
Yeah.
I'll no doubt speak to you soon about something.
Thank you all. It was great to be involved. See you soon.
All right, take care.
Bye.
Joining a professional body has never been more important. Join thousands of other professionals just like you who are getting ahead with CIHT membership. Go to the CIHT website and discover exclusive resources and why the leaders and future leaders of the sector are members with CIHT.